Very much. Hey, everybody. So I'm Micah Miller from SUSE, and now that we're just a couple weeks past the 6-year anniversary of OpenStack, I can't resist just indulging in a little bit of nostalgia. So if we think back to what the world was like back there at the start, back in the early 2010s, it was really quite different in so many ways. For one thing, there was no Pokemon Go, right? But instead, there was stuff that was oddly similar in a way. There were SUSE pets, and Angry Birds was kind of the thing back then. But more importantly, at that time in the industry, there really was no clear consensus yet on what open source technology was the right choice for cloud infrastructure. There were, however, a variety of different projects in different stages of emergence, different degrees of vendor engagement and contribution, vendor control and independence. Some of those things like Eucalyptus, CloudStack, for example. Some of those projects had pretty significant levels of engagement and traction. And so, at that time, with that uncertainty, the idea of starting yet another cloud infrastructure open source project struck some as a little bit nutty. It's hard to think that way now, but back then, that's what it seemed like. In fact, there were industry analysts back then that were highly skeptical of OpenStack. I think many of you probably remember some of the commentary written back then. I mean, it was downright scathing. It was a tough time. But yet, at the same time, at those early design summits, this small group of a couple hundred folks getting together had a passion and had a vision. And so that promise of OpenStack, that promise of agility and innovation based on open source standards and an open API survived and drew more and more contributors, more and more corporate sponsors, and everybody stuck with it. And I think the industry was ready at that time for a truly independent foundation to drive the next phase of open source innovation for cloud infrastructure. And that's why SUSE joined back then in those early days as a founding member, helped build the OpenStack Foundation, because we truly believed in that vision. Now, if you jump forward to the present, we can all appreciate what a present OpenStack really was. It has now clearly emerged as the open source project for cloud infrastructure. I don't think there's really any doubt about that anymore. And many of those, if not all of those industry analysts who were so skeptical back in the day, and I can't blame them for that back then, are all on board now. In fact, one industry analyst, the 451 group, has predicted that this year's OpenStack business potential is about $1.8 billion, which is not too shabby. But what's even more important and more critical than that is that they're also predicting a compound annual growth rate of 35%, which is even more important to the future of what we're all doing. Now, at SUSE, we've also done some market research, and we surveyed a wide range of different enterprise IT leaders, not just SUSE customers, but a broader range. And we found some really great findings as well. We found that 93% of those leaders that we interviewed are planning to incorporate infrastructure as a service as a strategic element of their future plans. We found that 80% of the large companies that identify themselves as large in the context of this survey have already decided to use OpenStack for their infrastructure as a service implementations. And 15% of those 80% have already adopted OpenStack. So now in the present, you see the emergence of OpenStack as the standard. You see real engagement across industries, across geographies. We see all sorts of different use cases moving into production. We've really come an enormous way in these 6 years. But at the same time, it's not all rainbows and unicorns here in OpenStack land. There are still real challenges, and we need to continue to band together as a community and collaborate to solve those. And I really like some of the things that Jason Bryce said yesterday morning in his keynote about collaboration and creating a positive sum game together versus a negative sum game. That's what we need to do to address some of these challenges. Now, there's all kinds of things we could talk about as the next areas to focus on for OpenStack, but I just want to touch on 3: complexity, scale, and fragmentation. In that survey we did, we heard from IT leaders 63% of them in fact, that said that their OpenStack implementation experience was really difficult. OpenStack is still complex and it's still difficult. And that's something that we need to work on together upstream to solve. But we also need to realize it's not just a technology issue, it's also a skills and education issue. So part of the solution is developing the training, the education, and the certification programs that are needed to bring our users along with us. Now, scale. Another good side effect of all this momentum and success that we're experiencing together with OpenStack is that we've moved past the day one scenarios, the tire kicking, the pure experimentation days, and now we're into the real world. And now collectively, we need to start thinking about those real world, large-scale deployments of not just hundreds, but thousands of nodes, multiple clouds interconnected together. And we need to think through the implications from security, manageability, and orchestration, because at that scale, the issues are completely different. What worked beautifully in the early days of POCs and demonstrations doesn't necessarily scale there. And again, we need to come together and do that as a community. And then third, we need to find ways to align on key technologies and APIs and avoid the fragmentation that's going to make our users hesitate to embrace OpenStack for production use. So there's several areas like that, and I really commend some of the product working group and the enterprise working group that I think are working on these things. One of the things I heard a lot about at this conference that I think is a move forward to solve this fragmentation problem is the synergy emerging around Kubernetes, for example. That's a really good sign. But there's more areas where we need to come together and align. Now, if we can collectively get together, maintain that momentum, and collaborate, I see an incredibly interesting future for us. And as I look out over this software-defined everything world that we now live in, I see several interesting features in the landscape emerging through the clouds. First of all, I see OpenStack itself becoming a foundational framework for software-defined technologies across compute, storage, networking, applications, and more. I also see containers and orchestration moving from the hype phase to the reality phase in the coming years, and literally changing the paradigm of how we build, deploy, and manage not just our workloads and applications, but also the very infrastructure in which we're running these things in, back to point one. And then thirdly, I see a developer-led, applications-first revolution that we're all in the midst of really coming into its own. But I don't see that revolution making the infrastructure components of the architecture irrelevant, which is something I'm really enjoying the debate about, even if the packaging and delivery models change. In fact, I see this revolution driving even more innovation in the infrastructure layers because it's going to demand that we make the infrastructure more transparent, less invasive, and more integrated with our application development technologies. So we need to find ways to bring things together. For example, connecting what we're doing with OpenStack with what we're doing in open source around platform as a service and projects like Cloud Foundry. Now, if we can bring that all together, we're going to have an incredibly bright future. Now, that's the vision of the future that we're embracing at SUSE with our enterprise operating system, our own OpenStack distribution, as well as our distributed storage offerings. Love to talk to any of you about all of that in more detail, and I hope to see you around. Thank you very much.